On behalf of all my sisters, it is with much joy that I welcome you to our community's second lecture in this year of the Carmelite Order's celebration of the 5th centenary of St. Teresa of Avila's birth. Your presence here is an opportunity to share with you the deep spirituality and tradition of Carmelite prayer that St. Teresa left not only to our church, but also to the wider world. St. Teresa was a woman of holy daring. Her passion for God and her openness to the Spirit enabled her to go beyond the boundaries and limits of her time in regard to women. Her view of a life of prayer as an apostolic work was innovative and radical. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. Barbara Mujica, who will share with us her knowledge of Teresa as a woman of her time, yet ahead of her time.
We are privileged to have with us today for our second lecture Dr. Barbara Mujica, who is a professor of Spanish at Georgetown University. She's a specialist in the literature of the 16th and 17th centuries in Spain. And since Teresa of Avila is one of the period's few prominent women's writers, Dr. Mujica has included her writings in her courses, in her teaching for many years. In fact, she's written a book titled Women Writers of Early Modern Spain. However, in an article in Commonweal in February 2010, Dr. Mujica revealed how, in 1997, she discovered in Teresa a spiritual guide, a friend, who led her on a journey of faith and became a reassuring presence in her own life. In consequence, she began teaching courses on mysticism on Teresa and is an acknowledged scholar in the field of Teresian studies. She's traveled to all the monasteries in Spain that Teresa founded. She was telling me this just before we began today, and has visited with some of the best Spanish scholars in Spain, and been to our monasteries in the Low Countries and to the places where we came from. So she really has just delved and buried herself in the life and the works of Teresa. But she is also a novelist, a short story writer, an essayist, and a critic. She's a specialist in contemporary Latin American culture and President Emerita of the Association for Hispanic Classical Theater, and editor of Commedia Performance, a journal devoted to early modern theater. As I said, she's written extensively on Spanish literature, mysticism, the pastoral novel, early modern women, which I said before, and her latest book on Teresa is entitled Teresa de Avila, Lettered Woman, and is a fascinating study of Teresa's letters. Sister Teresa, a novel, was adapted for the stage and is now, well, I think, it was adapted under the name God's Gypsies in Los Angeles and opened at the Elephant Theater in Los Angeles in November 2013. And I think is now preparing to tour, possibly. She's published 8 anthologies of Spanish American literature, and her articles have appeared in many academic journals and essay collections. Her novel, Frida, has appeared, as you would have read, in 17 languages, and her latest novel, I Am Venus, inspired by Roque's Venus of Spanish painter Diego Velázquez, was published in November 2013. I say all of this only to say what a versatile, talented woman we have here. She's won numerous prizes for her writing, most recently from the Maryland Writers Association for I Am Venus in the category Historical Fiction, and for Imagining Iraq in the category of Short Story. She has also won the Trailblazers Award for Frida and other writings, the Pangolin Prize for Best Short Story of the Year, and she's also won an international fiction competition. In addition, she's received grants and awards from poets and writers of New York, the Spanish government, of course, Georgetown University, and other institutions. She is a two-time nominee for the Pushcart Prize for Fiction. Barbara Mujica's essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Miami Herald, the Dallas Morning Star, and hundreds of other publications. Her essay, Bilingualism's Goal, was named one of the best 50 op-eds of the decade by the New York Times. I'm almost finished. There's actually so much more I could say, even what I'm saying, but since her son returned from Iraq, Dr. Mujica has become active in veterans issues also. She's faculty advisor of the Georgetown University chapter of Student Veterans of America and associate facilitator of the Veterans Support Team, a group of administrators, faculty, and students interested in veterans affairs. She works closely with the administration to make Georgetown a veteran-friendly campus and frequently speaks and publishes on veteran-related issues. I thought that was a really different and interesting thing about her. So now, please help me to welcome Dr. Avila.
Anyhow, I'm here today to talk to you about my friend, Teresa of Avila. And I think she's probably the personal friend of everybody in this room. Although it may seem like an anachronism, I do think it's appropriate to ask, was St. Teresa a feminist? After all, contemporary feminism has thrust Teresa into the public limelight in academia. Books such as Alison Weber's Teresa of Avila and The Rhetoric of Femininity has inspired countless articles and papers on Teresa as an energetic, determined woman who defied the social norms of her time and launched the reform movement, outsmarting and misogynistic clergy by manipulating language in order to appear unthreatening. Weber's study of Teresa's language is one of several groundbreaking books written in the 1980s and 1990s that inspired a flourishing outburst of research on topics such as the permeability of the content before the Council of Trent, the culture of the cloister, the so-called rhetoric of modesty used by women throughout Europe, and men too sometimes, women's education, and women's letter writing. Today, Teresa is reaching an audience beyond academia as both a feminist icon and a spiritual teacher. The current climate of spiritual seeking and disillusion with conventional religion has sparked an explosion of popular interest in alternative approaches to faith, and some modern readers, of course, have tended to reconstruct Teresa according to today's cultural standards, and some of them cast her in a kind of as a New Age guru who found God within rather than in stagnant religious practices. There's much I could say about some of the misunderstandings about who Teresa really was. The popular self-help writer Carolyn Myss has created a small industry around Teresa with her Entering the Castle books and CDs. New books on Teresa have appeared during the last few years in Germany, Italy, and of course Spain and Latin America. France, long considered a bastion of secularism, has produced a surprising number of books on Teresa, including one by Julia Kristeva, the prolific but Bulgarian-born philosopher, feminist critic, and psychoanalyst. In fact, a recent Publisher Weekly's article described Teresa as a mystic for our time. But the issue is complex, and more complex than it might seem on the face of it. Teresa was a woman of her times, and she seems to have shared her society's highly negative view of women. In fact, Teresa's derogation of women occurs so frequently, too frequently, to simply dismiss. Much of her scorn is directed towards herself. In the book of her life, she refers to herself as a poor little woman, weak and with hardly any fortitude. Her self-derision is undoubtedly, as Alison Weber argues, part of a strategy that allows her to appear humble while asserting spiritual authority. But why must she belittle her entire sex? The nature of women is weak, she writes in the Book of Foundations. In Interior Castle, she laments our womanly dullness of mind. In life, she goes so far as to confess that just being a woman is enough to depress her. Had Teresa completely assimilated the misogynistic attitudes of contemporary moralists? To answer the question, we must keep in mind Teresa's historical context. The Middle Ages had inherited from Aristotle and other sources the notion that woman was an incomplete and defective being. In fact, some questioned whether she even had a soul. Although a few thinkers protested, notably Christine de Pizan, the French medieval writer, whose City of Ladies is an energetic defense of her sex, it was not until the 16th century that the worth of women became a topic of heated debate, a result in part of Queen Elizabeth's ascension to the throne of England. While the most conservative theologians saw women as daughters of Eve, whose disobedience had brought evil upon the human race, others defended women's spiritual potential. A few argued that women could be as lucid, composed, and valiant as men. Although females were not supposed to aspire to intellectual excellence, and few studied Latin, some moralists, such as Juan Luis Vives, Erasmus, and Fray Luis de Leon, argued that women should learn to read in the vernacular so they could, through exposure to inspirational books, improve their souls and teach their children. Early modern supporters of women cannot be considered feminists in the modern sense, since they had no concern for the political, social, legal, and financial equality of the sexes. Even the most progressive thinkers assumed that women needed to be controlled by men. We find this in Juan Luis Vives, for example, who's a very progressive thinker. However, they did believe that by practicing feminine virtues, such as obedience, resignation, and chastity, women could reach a degree of perfection. Since in Catholic lands, celibacy was held in higher esteem than marriage, the convent was a prestigious option for women. Although, with few exceptions, women could not hope for political or intellectual glory, they could aspire to purity and even sanctity. The Church offered numerous role models, starting with the Virgin Mary. One of the most common arguments in defense of women was the androgyny of the soul. François de Billon argued in a 1555 treatise that since God is incorporeal and has both masculine and feminine attributes, and since he created both man and woman in his image, the soul is androgynous. Some thinkers went so far as to argue that any person could have the characteristics generally associated with the opposite sex. Thus, a woman could be rational. Rationalism is a masculine attribute, according to these thinkers. So a woman could be as rational as a man, and a man could be sentimental as a woman. The mujer varonil, that is the manly woman, became the model of the smart, strong, courageous woman, virility being associated not with sexual identity, but with moral perfection. When Teresa urges her nuns to be virile, or manly, or soldiers, she is promoting resoluteness and constancy among women. Building on the notion of spiritual androgyny, Teresa reiterates throughout her works that any soul is capable of achieving a degree of perfection. Instead of insisting on sexual equality, she recognizes women's limitations, which she shrewdly twists into an advantage. Since God favors the weak, she argues, women's frailty is a blessing. Basing her argument on the notion that females are particularly susceptible to religious experience, she notes in Foundations that the Lord lets his magnificent riches show forth in us weak little women. And she points out that there are many more women than men to whom the Lord grants these favors. Teresa's censure of women is not necessarily insincere. Many talented women echo prevailing misogynistic thought. But for Teresa, women's inferiority was a help rather than a hindrance in the quest for spiritual perfection. The biblical teaching, the last shall be first, was proof that God favored the lowly and the humble. Another important point is that humility was, and is, a virtue to which all devout people were to aspire. Elena Carrera stresses the importance of humility to both religious men and women, indirectly countering Weber's position that Teresa's expressions of humility were basically a rhetorical strategy. For Carrera, Teresa struggled to be humble, and Teresa herself said in the book of her life that it was hard for her to be humble, that she had a tendency to be vain, and so she struggled against this. So I think there's a lot of truth in what Allison writes, but I also think that it's more complex than that. Everything seems to be more complex than what we think. But I think to see Teresa as simply using humility as a rhetorical strategy, if not understood completely, can seem to reduce her to a hypocrite. And I certainly don't think that she was. And this is something that students always say. But if she's using it as a strategy, how can this really be sincere? But I think it can be both. I think that she's clever enough to realize that certain kinds of rhetorical expressions keep her out of trouble, at the same time that she can really be striving for humility. In Teresa's day, convents were often overcrowded, gossipy, highly politicized, and populated by rich women who brought servants and material comforts with them. It's not like that anymore. At least not the convents that I know. Such convents hardly offered an environment conducive to spiritual improvement. Teresa set out to provide women with truly spiritual surroundings by founding discalced convents. Discalced, but the nuns wore sandals. I want to point that out. My students always say, discalced, they go around barefoot. No. Where nuns could live cloistered and in poverty. As Maria Cadrion points out, the nun's physical withdrawal into the convent reflects the inward spiritual movement of the soul seeking God. For Teresa, the cloister did not deprive women of freedom, but liberated them from the distractions of everyday life. thereby enabling them to devote themselves entirely to prayer. In Teresa's view, the key to spiritual health. In Way of Perfection, she praises conventual life, in which detachment from the world and the existence of a prayer community enable women to cultivate their souls. By adopting the unmitigated rule, Teresa affirmed that women as well as men could live in poverty in imitation of Christ. At a time when the church was challenged not only by tepid religious practice, but also by encroaching Protestantism, Teresa was anxious to play an active role in defense of the faith. Jody Billinghoff argues that Teresa deeply envied male priests because they had the freedom to preach and proselytize. She saw founding convents as a means of achieving an apostolate that she had long yearned for, but as a woman had been denied. Carol Slade points out that Teresa aspired to model herself after Mary Magdalene, whom she saw as an apostle working tirelessly to bring Christ souls. The new convents enabled her nuns to do their part, for by praying constantly, they contributed not only to their own spiritual renewal, but also to the revitalization of the church. Thus, Teresa saw the discalced reform as spiritual activism. If male clerics engaged in active apostolates, discalced Carmelite nuns could exercise an apostolate of prayer, writes Billinghoff. Teresa clearly believed that women had both a duty and a right to take an active role in the defense of the faith. In the 16th century, convents were often supported by wealthy patrons who sometimes demanded that nuns pray in perpetuity for their families, that is, for the sponsors' families. Teresa attempted to avoid accepting patronage, thereby freeing her nuns to pray for the church as a whole, not just for wealthy patrons. For Teresa, founding convents and writing manuals such as The Way of Perfection and Interior Castle were part of the same enterprise, to guide souls, especially those of her nuns, on their spiritual journey. All of Teresa's books were written at the behest of spiritual directors, and priests sometimes manipulated the writings of their directees, Billinghoff points out. However, Weber presents evidence that Teresa maintained significant control over her writing, which she used not only to assert authority, but also to provide spiritual direction to her nuns. Although Teresa casts her writing as an act of obedience, she often assumes the role of doctrinal teacher, a daring maneuver in a society that forbade women to preach. By cloaking her instruction in unassuming language as confession, anecdote, a gloss on the Paternoster, or convent history, she succeeds in articulating her views without riling the censors. But she was very clever. Weber says in one of her articles that it was really a miracle that she didn't get caught. It really was a miracle that she was investigated by the Inquisition a number of times, and it really is a miracle that she got away with some of the things that she did, like founding the order that you belong to. In the 16th century, both moralists and poets defined women in terms of their bodies. Bevis is The Education of a Christian Woman, and Fray Luis de Leon's The Perfect Wife, influential books that circulated widely in Spain and elsewhere, state that a man's priority is securing the chastity of the women under his control. Social codes of the period identified the female body as a repository of male honor and dictated that transgressions by women were to be severely punished. The obsession with lineage or purity of blood put an additional onus on women, since a man could never be certain his wife was carrying a child with uncontaminated blood unless he maintained absolute control over her sexuality. That's why in the theater, when a man suspects his wife of having some kind of an adulterous relationship, even if it is not proven, even if he only suspects it, and the evidence is very, very circumstantial, he feels that it is his duty to punish who? The woman, right. So not necessarily the man with whom she's accused of having an affair with, but her. And the punishment was death. So in those plays, the woman always dies, and sometimes in a very horrible way. Poets also contributed to women's objectification by idealizing the dama, or lady, whom they described in terms of generic physical attributes, using an erotic vocabulary inherited from Petrarch. They robbed women of their individuality. For example, in Sonnet 23, Teresa of Avila portrays his lady only through metaphor: roses for lips, lilies for skin, gold for hair, and whiteness for neck. Rather than a flesh and blood woman, the Dama is a catalyst for the introspection of the male poetic I. In contrast, Teresa argues that a woman is soul as well as body. The soul is a palace inhabited by a great king, God. Quote, "Well, let us imagine that within us is an extremely rich palace, built entirely of gold and precious stones, in some built of a lord such as this. Imagine, too, that you have a part to play in order for the palace to be so beautiful, for there is no edifice as beautiful as is a soul pure and full of virtue." She urges her nuns not to imagine that they are hollow inside, that is, just an outer case, but to remember their inner richness and beauty. Each woman must cultivate her own soul in her own way and at her own pace. Each must find her own way of perfection. Teresa warns nuns repeatedly against comparing their own spiritual progress with anyone else's, or resenting another sister's spiritual favors. Although Teresa preferred mental or silent prayer over ritual chanted prayers, she recognized that different methods were effective for different people. Both mental and vocal prayer had a place in her convents. I am not speaking now about whether the prayer should be mental or vocal for everyone, she says. In your case, I say you need both. That's in Way of Perfection. She provides a commentary on the Padre Noster in Way of Perfection to help those who are not yet ready for mental prayer to derive maximum benefit from vocal prayer. At the same time, she encourages nuns who have made sufficient spiritual progress to practice mental prayer, despite the objections of some theologians who thought it was too dangerous for impressionable women. Teresa's position constitutes not only a defense of women's capabilities to pursue higher forms of prayer and contemplation, but also a rejection of patriarchal social structure. Carrion defines the Teresian palace described in the interior castle as an alcázar, a walled compound in which a woman can seek refuge, a space governed by God into which not even her father or confessor can intrude. Carrion also notes that Teresa's detailed descriptions of her illness and physical deterioration undermine the image of woman as an alabaster temple, replacing it with another of a woman as a spiritual being. Interiority offers nuns protection, not only from the temptations of the material world, but also against social norms that reduce women to mere custodians of their husbands' or fathers' reputations. Significantly, Teresa abolished the use of titles in her convents. Titles of nobility, even doña, signify rank derived from fathers or husbands. By abolishing titles, Teresa created a society in which a woman's worth was determined not by the position of male relations, but by the purity of her soul. Furthermore, of converso origin herself, she declined to investigate her postulant's lineage. Although Teresa is remembered for her religious reforms, Slade argues that such reforms have a social dimension. She writes, Teresa also intended and indeed effected social reforms, specifically increasing autonomy for women and integrating conversos into Spanish society. Teresa's abolition of class and ethnic distinctions in the convent constitutes a significant act of resistance against social norms. In Teresa's time, many families were willing or able to provide a marriage dowry only for the first or second daughter. Don't forget, families were very big. There could be 11, 13, even 15 people or children in a family. Teresa was one of the 11. And there could be a lot of daughters. Typically, only the first two got married. So they placed the younger daughters often in convents, sometimes at 4 or 5 years old, although there are cases where they were placed in convents at 2 or 3 years old. Since the dowry required by convents was generally much, much lower than a marriage dowry. As a result, many women with no vocations were fated for religious life. Teresa's requirement that postulants be at least 17 reflects her desire to make certain that every discalced Carmelite nun take vows of her own free will, thereby guaranteeing her a say in her own destiny. Furthermore, Teresa's decision to accept good postulants, regardless of their ability to pay a dowry, demonstrates her respect for spirituality over inherited wealth. Although Teresa originally hoped to forego convent dowries completely, financial pressures eventually forced her to accept them. Another pecuniary issue was patronage. To free her nuns from outside pressures, Teresa at first rejected patronage completely. However, practical considerations forced her to modify this stance as well. But she was a practical businesswoman. And when she had to make changes, she did. Teresa's feminism shines through much of her writing, directed towards nuns. The chattiness of her style creates a sense of intimacy and camaraderie. She envisions her convents not as prisons, but as communities imbued with love and respect for all members. Although nuns were expected to conform to the rule, and punishments were stipulated for transgressors, Teresa preferred the soft touch rather than rigorous discipline. She writes in the constitutions that the priors of a discalced Carmelite convent should strive to be loved so that she may be obeyed. People who followed this after her death got into a lot of trouble. And if anybody asks me a question about that, I'll be glad to expand, because that's what I'm working on now. Foundations is full of such admonitions. She also wrote, she wrote a lot about this particular topic. The concern Teresa showed for the psychological well-being of her nuns also evinces her feminism. Her comments on melancholia, for example, what we call today depression, in women in Foundations suggests that she possessed a deep understanding of feminine psychology, and her compassion, insight, and sense of humor undoubtedly made her an excellent spiritual director. She believed that women were perfectly capable of guiding other women. In fact, she begins The Way of Perfection by remarking that her age and experience living in monasteries make her more successful than learned men in guiding women. As Alison Weber writes, and others, Julian Algren, many others, Carol Slade, they've all noted that Teresa often appeals to her experience to assert her spiritual authority over letrados, that is, learned men, men who knew about theology, who had studied at the university. Many of these men had little personal knowledge of God's grace, however. Here, her appeal goes hand in hand with a censure. She says, since these learned men have other, more important occupations and are strong, they don't pay attention to things and don't seem to amount to much in themselves. That don't seem to amount to much in themselves. So what she's really saying is that although, and she's saying it with a lot of tact, but she's saying that these powerful erudite priests are often incompetent when it comes to guiding women spiritually, noting that they are too busy to listen to women carefully. So I know we have some spiritual directors here present, and they are the exception. The fact that they're here shows that they're listening to me. That shows that they're the exception. So I'm not mentioning names, but you know who you are. Again, appealing to her experience, she then asserts her own effectiveness in this area. Teresa even wrote an instructional manual on making the visitation for visitators, that is, priests who visited convents to enforce rules, teaching them how to deal effectively with prioresses and nuns. That's because they didn't know. Teresa taught her prioresses to guide the women in their charge. Foundations and constitutions are full of advice to prioresses for guiding nuns. Evidence that Teresa believed that women, not just priests, could minister to women's spiritual needs. In fact, Teresa thought that women could guide not only other women, but also men. She herself provided spiritual direction for other men, among them her young collaborator, Jerónimo Gracián, and her brother, Lorenzo. Despite the power women entrusted to prioresses and other nuns, a convent cannot be entirely a society of women. Only priests can administer the sacraments, and so nuns necessarily depend on men. Having suffered at the hands of inept confessors who mortified her with allegations that her visions came from the devil, Teresa insisted that her nuns be guided by competent men. Throughout her books, she reinstates the importance of compassionate, learned confessors who respect women's spiritual integrity. She believed nuns should be able to choose their confessors and even allow them to select priests from outside the order or to change confessors if they were dissatisfied. And that's something else that got her followers into a lot of trouble. She could get away with it, but they couldn't. At least not easily. When confessors became abusive in her convents, Teresa appealed not only to God, but also to temporal authorities. She replaced the malicious Calce Carmelite confessors of Incarnation Convent in Avila with two benevolent discalced friars, John of the Cross and Germán de San Matías. When the infuriated Calced Carmelites kidnapped and imprisoned these two, Teresa complained directly to King Philip II. Shy, poor little woman. Discalced convents offered women opportunities for spiritual development as well as education. From the Middle Ages, convents had been centers of learning for women. But in the 16th century, not all religious houses provided instruction. Despite Teresa's repeated assertions that she is just a poor, ignorant woman, she had clearly read widely in vernacular. She mentions the importance in her own spiritual journey of works such as the Confessions of St. Augustine and the Vita Christi of Saxony, which she read in Spanish translations. Because she wanted to make such books accessible to her nuns, she required them to learn to read. And in Article 40 of the Constitutions, charges prioresses with having them taught. In Article 8, she stipulates, the prioress should see to it that good books are available, especially the Life of Christ, the Flos Sanctorum, the Imitation of Christ, the Oratory of Religious, and those books written by Fray Luis de Granada and Father Fray Pedro de Alcántara. Teresa considered literacy a protection for women against incompetent spiritual directors. The Index of 1559 prohibited many devotional books popular among nuns, as well as 14 editions of the Bible and 9 of the New Testament. Amuf Teresa protests indirectly when she writes, if our nature were not so weak, our devotion so lukewarm, there wouldn't be any need for other books. The implication is that since women are so imperfect, they do need books. Teresa's letters to her brother Lorenzo, in which she suggests schools for his sons, attest to her interest in education. And in fact, in a letter dated the 27th of May, 1568, to Luisa de la Cerda, she mentions plans to establish a school for girls, a project that was not carried out. Although all nuns were required to learn to read, that is all Discalced Carmelite nuns were required to learn to read, not all learned to write. White-veiled nuns who perform menial tasks usually learned only to read, but not to write. Black-veiled choir nuns, those responsible for praying the divine office and doing all the other really intellectual tasks in the convent, received a more thorough education, learning to read and write. Some used their writing skills to produce literature, hagiographies, chronicles, spiritual treatises, poetry, and plays. Many wrote vidas, nearly always at the command of their confessors. These were not autobiographies in the modern sense, but spiritual memoirs that included prayers, descriptions of visions and locutions, and commentaries. Isabelle Poutrin says that nuns wrote so much that religious houses became autobiography workshops. Electa Arenal and Stacy Schlau argue that Carmelite convents developed into true intellectual communities where women's lives were recorded and thereby validated. Convents offered women vocational opportunities not available elsewhere. Prioresses were responsible for the general administration of the house, including financial management, assignment of duties, and admission of postulants. The cellaress attended to the purchase of provisions. The novice mistress prepared neophytes for their profession, teaching them reading, writing, and religion. An extern, often an elderly nun, not tempted by earthly delights, tended the turn. The window being the outside, that is, the turn being the window to the outside world. Nuns might also be chroniclers, biographers, painters, composers, singers, teachers, poets, historians, and even playwrights who composed entertainments for special occasions. In her constitutions, Teresa defines the duties of each of the major positions in Discalced convents. Although Discalced Carmelite convents were egalitarian for their day, prioresses were definitely in charge, and Teresa was in charge of the prioresses. She wrote to them constantly, guiding them in their administrative duties, inquiring about their health and needs, and offering direction to in the delicate area of discernment of spirits. Teresa was strict with her prioresses and could be cross with them when they failed to obey her. When Maria Bautista, prioress of the Valladolid Carmel, dallied in accepting a postulant that Teresa was anxious to admit, Teresa wrote to her a scathing letter. That you think you know everything is disheartening. No prioress has ever taken such a stance with me, nor anyone who is not a prioress. I tell you that by acting in such a way, you will lose my friendship. Although Teresa could be warm and encouraging, she could also be autocratic. As foundress and chief administrator, she believed her subordinates, vow of obedience, bound them to abide by her decisions. Still, Teresa was a positive role model for generations of Carmelites. Her spirituality engendered activism, impelling her to found 17 convents in all parts of Spain. Because she was a woman, the daughter of a converso and a mystic, Teresa was subjected to constant scrutiny. Weber has elucidated how Teresa used rhetorical strategies, such as expressions of uncertainty and self-deprecation, and appeals to her own experience to outmaneuver her persecutors and assert her own authority. Despite her tact when dealing with her superiors, men who dismissed women as stupid or false irritated her. In a passage from Way of Perfection, deleted by censors, she complains, "Since the world's judges are sons of Adam, and all of them male, there is no virtue in women that they do not hold suspect." In other words, if they hold you suspect, that's a good thing. The image of Teresa that emerges from her books, Particular Foundations, is that of a strong, determined woman who takes on prelates, property owners, lawyers, aristocrats, workmen, and even the king himself in order to accomplish her mission. Teresa affirmed her own authority and that of other women by creating spaces for women occupied and governed by females and devoted to their spiritual well-being. She was a brilliant politician, administrator, and fundraiser who knew how to deal with people of all classes and ages, male and female, religious and lay. She navigated effectively through the morass of church dignitaries, inquisitors, Calced Carmelites, families opposed to their daughter's vocation, and conflicted nuns. She defended women against accusations of spiritual ineptitude. Her spiritual daughters followed her lead, bringing the reform to Portugal, France, Italy, the Low Countries, and the New World, and beyond. As a saint and a doctor of the church, she continues to inspire women today. So to answer the question, was Teresa feminist, I would say this. Teresa was a product of her times and undoubtedly believed that women were flawed in some areas, but she turned women's supposed imperfections into a defense of their special spiritual aptitude. Furthermore, as a reformer who saw women as whole beings with spiritual needs, a foe of abusive convent confessors, a promoter of women's education, a model of leadership who provided women with the tools and experience they needed to achieve administrative excellence, Teresa was most certainly a champion of her sex, a true feminist. I want to end with one final comment. I think that the measure of a leader is her ability to inspire others. Other women followed her lead, and other men and men followed her lead. Well, she was a manly woman, she said. Anyhow, lots of people followed her lead. But just a couple of months ago, I was in the Biblioteca Nacional, the National Library in Lisbon, looking for information about the Lisbon convent founded by Teresa's friend, Maria de San Jose, whose story is very sad. She was one of the ones who tried to continue Teresa's constitutions and was condemned for it by the male members of the order. But anyhow, so I was looking for stuff on Maria de San Jose, and I came across something by Gracian, Teresa's friend Gracian, that I hadn't read, and that was the Delucidario, in which he kind of explains informally Teresa's thought. And I was astounded to come across a passage that is a passionate defense of the intellectual woman, clearly inspired by Teresa. And I have seen many defenses of the writing woman who was inspired by God to write. But the idea is always that the writing woman doesn't write of her own accord. And if you think of pictures of Teresa that you've seen writing, if you think of the Maria de Ovidos, for example, it's all over. Teresa is writing, but there's always a dove above her. and the idea is that the ideas come from God, and she's the vehicle. And she even says that at the beginning of Las Moradas, the interior castle, that I can't think of how to say this, but God has inspired me, and so so I am His vehicle. But Gracian says yes, there are women who write because they are inspired by God, but there are women who are authentically intellectual, and they can think for themselves, and they can formulate ideas for themselves. And I thought that was just amazing. It was written in 1608, so Teresa dies in 1582. So he is carrying out her legacy. And also I'm working with the letters of Maria de San Jose, her friend, and her other disciples who took the reform into France and the Low Countries. And the letters are full of admonitions to nuns. And Maria suffered a great deal. And there's a letter where she's writing from Portugal to her sisters in Seville. And she says, remember Teresa, remember the role model that she was, remember the strength that she exhibited. We have to be like her, strong soldiers. So, enough said. If that wasn't a feminist, then I don't know what else is.